This is LBC News.
So in my headlines there, I mentioned about Donald Trump ruling out negotiations with Iran. It's a post he put on his Truth Social platform, but there appears to be some kind of rowing back. Let's get the latest here from LBC News US correspondent Simon Marks. Simon, good to have you with us this evening. What's the latest?
Well, Jonathan, as you will have seen, President Trump on Truth Social earlier today appeared to be demanding the unconditional surrender of Iran. But now the White House is saying he didn't really mean it, at least not in the sense of a kind of a World War II surrender by Japan to powers that were overwhelming Japan, of course, led by the United States at the end of the Second World War. According to Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, what the president meant when he said unconditional surrender is basically not much more than the military defeat of Iran. This is a Caroline Leavitt quote in a conversation with reporters a short while ago. When he, as Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Armed Forces, determines that Iran no longer poses a threat to the United States of America and the goal of Operation Epic Fury has been fully realized, then Iran will essentially be in a place of unconditional surrender. Now, that word essentially is obviously doing an enormous amount of work in a sentence that appears designed to do away with any suggestion that Donald Trump is demanding any kind of formal process of the Iranian government waving the white flag and saying, we give up, please stop your war. She's basically saying that the President of the United States will deem Iran in a position of unconditional surrender once he's met all of his military objectives, which of course include destroying Iran's stockpile of ballistic missiles, making sure that Iran never gets a nuclear weapon, and destroying the Iranian Navy. But what he's not talking about, according to the White House, is what I think we all thought he was talking about, an unconditional surrender of Iran, which would imply that he was no longer interested in the possibility of engaging in any kind of conversation with any figures from Iran's government. Whereas only 24 hours ago, and listen, we've been through so many variables over the course of the last week, it's hard to keep up. So many sands have been shifting under our feet as we've tried to cover this story. But 24 hours ago, the president seemed to be holding out the possibility of dealing with at least remnants of the Iranian regime, saying that he fancied the idea of a kind of a Venezuela-style deal. He cited the rise to power in Caracas of President Delcy Rodriguez, succeeding, of course, President Nicolas Maduro, who was overthrown by the United States in January. She used to be his number two, and she's still leading his government. So that once again rekindled this idea that Donald Trump is open to dealing with members of the Iranian government. The phrase unconditional surrender, of course, appeared to put paid to that, but now White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt walking that back. She's also been making a bit of news here over a growing number of reports, and I see the Financial Times has just published the latest one, revealing that the Russians have been sharing information with the Iranians that give them targeting information about the location of U.S. military forces. Now, you might think the White House would be absolutely furious about the idea that the Russians were helping the Iranians possibly prepare to target American forces for destruction and perhaps even the death of American service personnel. But when this was put to Caroline Leavitt at the White House, she said, well, if the Russians are doing that, it's certainly not having any effect on the Iranians because we are pummeling them. We are decimating them. So no concern being evinced whatsoever about what would be an extraordinarily pugnacious and dangerous move move by Russian President Vladimir Putin to pass on targeting information about the precise location of American forces as those armed forces service personnel risk their lives for the United States trying to overthrow the Iranian government. But as ever, when it comes to Russia, everything that comes out of this White House is always a surprise.
Well, like you say, you know, there's so many shifting sands, and this story is kind of like dominating, as you'd expect. But there is the news today that the U.S. Justice Department has released missing records from the Epstein files containing sexual assault allegations against Donald Trump. The White House press secretary is understood to have called the woman's claims completely baseless accusations backed by zero credible evidence. So what do we know at the moment regarding these revelations, and what's been released?
Well, we've got 16 new pages that were not included among the 3 million documents that were released on January the 30th. And investigative journalists engaged in some considerable internet sleuthing discovered that where those documents appeared to be suggesting that this woman who'd been interviewed in 2019 by the FBI had only been interviewed once. In fact, she'd been interviewed 4 times. And so there were huge questions, of course, about why the FBI decided to interview her 4 times. And did that indicate, perhaps, that the FBI was taking her claims about Jeffrey Epstein and Donald Trump both abusing her sexually when she was a teenager in the 1980s? Were they taking those claims more seriously than the original release of documents suggested? So we now know that indeed she was interviewed three additional times. She first contacted the Department of Justice in 2019 after Jeffrey Epstein's arrest. She claimed that he assaulted her on Hilton Head Island, which is in South Carolina, where she lived when she was a teenager. She then claimed that she had been conveyed by Jeffrey Epstein to either New York or New Jersey, taken to what she described as a very tall building with huge rooms, in which she claims that the President of the United States, Donald Trump, of course then not president, allegedly sexually assaulted her. Now, what we don't know from this additional release of documents is whether the FBI deemed her allegations credible or not. The White House, as you said, is dismissing them out of hand and saying that they are completely baseless and lack any credible evidence. She also questioned the credibility of the woman making these accusations, whose name is not included in the release of files, but says that the woman did have a criminal record that is documented in these files. And the Department of Justice has already told everybody that when you read these claims against Jeffrey Epstein and against President Trump in some cases, and we saw in that 3 million page trove of documents a summary of allegations that had been leveled against President Trump, that there's no indication contained in any of the documents about whether or not Department of Justice investigators and FBI agents thought that the allegations were credible. So all of this fuels the suggestion that the Department of Justice has been trying to cover something up, but it doesn't produce any concrete evidence that President Trump was engaged in nefarious or criminal activities that were considered publicly provided credible reports by either people who claim to have been abused or claim to have second-hand knowledge of someone else who had been abused. So it doesn't add very much to the totality of our understanding, but it certainly fuels calls for all the other 2 to 3 million pages of documents that the Department of Justice is sitting on to be released to the public. And as you know, the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, has herself now been subpoenaed to appear before the House Oversight Committee and explain why she's still holding on to papers.
Well, one of the things I'm interested in is the front page of the current Private Eye, which I know you won't get for a couple of weeks, but I know you've seen the front cover. And the reason why I'm mentioning this, you talk about, they sort of seem to suggest that because there's someone saying mission accomplished, and Trump saying, yes, I've killed the Epstein story with regards to this attack on Iran. I mean, is that being talked about there, Simon?
Yes, a bit. But I mean, I think there's absolutely no question that those of us who sit here as international observers of what is taking place in this country can see that President Trump over the last few weeks has been in need of a distraction for a whole host of different reasons. I mean, first of all, there were all of these questions swirling around the White House about these additional documents that the Department of Justice has now belatedly released. Questions that did make life pretty uncomfortable for President Trump, who had, of course, claimed absolution as a result of the January the 30th release, but another 16 pages of documents and 3 more interviews with an accuser, whether or not she was judged to be credible, certainly doesn't help him claim to have been absolved by the documents that had already been placed into the public domain. And there's more concern ahead, because with Pam Bondi subpoenaed by the House Oversight Committee, and a prominent Republican on that committee, Congresswoman Nancy Mace, telling Newsmax TV today that she thinks that the Attorney General is engaged in a cover-up. I mean, all of that is the continuing percussive drumbeat that, of course, leads people to wonder if there is more than meets the eye to Donald Trump's involvement with Jeffrey Epstein. I mean, there were other reasons why he needed distractions too. I mean, the Supreme Court evisceration of his tariffs policy, the partial withdrawal of federal agents from Minneapolis after massive public demonstrations there against his mass deportation efforts. You know, no shortage of reasons why Donald Trump might want to change the story.
Well, and today, Simon, 92,000 jobs were lost across the country in February.
Yes, absolutely. Very good point, Jonathan. Devastating jobs numbers for the White House today. 92,000 jobs lost at precisely a point where Donald Trump was hoping to be able to continue talking about growing the economy. Now, of course, he's buffeted with calls for billions of dollars in tariff refunds to go to some of the nation's largest importers and shipping companies, which the administration is now deliberately slow walking and indicating could be a 5-year legal battle for all of those people who paid import duties as a result of tariffs that we now know were unconstitutional. So for every reason in the book, Donald Trump distracting everybody's attention here in the United States and around the world by joining with Israel and engaging in this military action in Iran could be seen in crass political terms as a positive. The White House, of course, continues to argue that there was an imminent national security threat posed to the United States by Iran, even though it's pretty difficult to understand exactly what that threat was, and continues to say that Iran was 2 weeks away from acquiring a nuclear weapon, even though, again, it's hard to find any independent evidence to support that contention.
All right, Simon, I appreciate the insight. Thank you very much. LBC News US correspondent Simon Marks.
LBC News.